Welcome to Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, where we talk about gospel insights through great stories and help you find entertainment that is both true and beautiful. I'm your host, Liz Busby. I'm a writer of science fiction and fantasy and a reviewer of books and a Latter-day Saint. And with me today is Daniel. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Daniel.
Hi, I'm Daniel Ortner. I'm an attorney, a pop culture aficionado, a big fan of religious freedom. Excited to be here today.
And then we also have Jeff.
My name is Jeff Benyon. I'm in real estate, property management, lifelong Latter-day Saint, Francophile, and my one pop culture claim to fame, I do like to write, but I'm not much of a creative writer, unlike you, Liz, but I did have Doc Smith's sci-fi writing class, and he did like one of my stories.
The jealousy. And then we also have a special guest with us today. Van, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Van Gessel. I'm a retired professor of Japanese literature at Brigham Young University. And I've done a lot of work over the course of my career with the Japanese Catholic writer Endo Shusaku, who wrote the novel that we're going to be looking at, Silence. So I'm excited to be here.
Yes, we're going to be looking at the movie version of Silence today.
Yes.
It's going to be super interesting. But first, we're going to start with our best book segment, where each of us shares something that we are reading, watching, or listening to and help each other expand our horizons. My book today is a graphic novel mission memoir. It's called Dendo, 1 year and 1/2 in Tokyo by Brittany Long Olson. And this is something I'm truly jealous of. On her mission, she drew 1 page of comic every day for her journal and then published them. And it's just fascinating to see this illustrated version of the mission story, which is very common. And plus, it's set in Japan, which is where my husband served his mission and also relevant to our topic today. And it's a pretty good read, even for if you're trying to encourage your teenagers to go on a mission. It makes it really interesting and fun, and they get the perspective of mission life. My 12-year-old was just fascinated. I think he's read it 3 or 4 times. So I highly recommend Dendo.
Wow.
Daniel, how about you go next?
Sure. So I want to recommend not Japanese, but also something foreign. Two TV shows that I've been really I watched a while ago, but I've been kind of sticking with me, and I've been recommending them whenever I can. Which is Shtisel and Srugim, which are 2 Israeli TV shows. Shtisel is on Netflix, and Srugim is on Amazon Prime. They are both shows about Orthodox Jewish individuals. Shtisel is about a very, very Orthodox, kind of insular Jewish community in Jerusalem, and the main character longs to be an artist, but his culture doesn't really allow him to do that, and he falls in love, and it's about his life. Srugim, I would describe as a Jewish version of Friends, like an Orthodox Jewish version of Friends. It's a modern Orthodox, so they're more like members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, very similar to those people living in a singles ward kind of environment in terms of dating and culture, but really fascinating. I definitely would describe it like Friends-like, although maybe a little more drama-filled, a little more dramatic than Friends, but similar to Friends. Really light, really fun. I think they're both phenomenal shows. I really highly recommend either one of them or both of them.
We don't have to speak Hebrew.
No, it's going to be with subtitles. I'll say Shtisel is very much like you're watching a different world. Even for me, I grew up Jewish, kind of more secular Jewish culture. It's a culture shock. Srugim is less so. It's, I think for those who are members of any strong faith, it's very relatable. For members of the church, I think it would be very relatable to the kind of challenges of dating and single life in the church as well.
That's fascinating. I'm excited. I want to watch those. That sounds interesting.
They're great. Shtisel had a really big. It just came out with their 3rd season just a couple months ago. It was, and it's great, and it got a lot of attention. Actually, it was very popular on Netflix for a while. Srugim's a little older. It's been all out for a while, but also excellent. Really, and they're both phenomenal.
Okay, Jeff, have you got something to share with us today?
Yeah, I picked well, kind of a picks and pans, I guess. So on books, I'm reading. I just read and loved Artifact Space by Miles Cameron. That's science fiction. It's about basically this massive spaceship, but there's kind of a heist element and stuff. So really enjoyed that. My son and I have been reading Brandon Mould's Five Kingdoms series. I recommend that as well. There's some neat gospel truths they put in there. And then nonfiction, I've been reading the Book of Enoch, just because I've always been interested in their take on the antediluvian world. And I know it's not canon, but it certainly is interesting in the light it may or may not shed on that.
Now, you don't know this, but just before this episode, we recorded an episode on the film of Noah, and we talked about the Book of Enoch. So there you go.
That's cool. And then my wife and I have been watching on Peacock, The Lost Symbol, and we're not really liking it. But I will say it is probably the most pro. If you read the book, I do recommend the book. So I don't recommend the series on Peacock. It's okay. But the great thing about the Lost Symbol book by Dan Brown is it is the most pro-religion book of his. He's usually pretty anti-religion, but it's got a pro-Bible spin at the end. And then I hope that's not a spoiler. And then if you love Washington, D.C., it's really great. Just insight into the city and some of its design. So I don't really recommend the series, but I do recommend the book.
Well, I may have to put that on my reading list. I'm going to Washington, D.C. this summer, so
yeah, you should.
Fun one to read while we're traveling there. I always like to read books set where I'm traveling.
Yeah,
so.
I remember it felt very much like his other books, very cheesy and kind of fun and
cliffhangery chapters.
Very cliffhangery, but there's.
I think I was just not in the mood for that when I read it. I didn't like the book, but I appreciated it as someone who loves Washington D.C. though, as you mentioned.
Yeah,
who's lived there.
Okay, Van, what's your pick?
Before I get to my pick, really quickly, I want to mention a series that my wife and I just watched. I think it was Netflix. It may have been Amazon Prime, but in any case, it's out there. And it's a South Korean series called Crash Landing on You, which I know sounds just a little bit odd. But the basic premise of the show is that there's this very wealthy South Korean businesswoman who's involved very much in doing publicity for her cosmetic and fashion company. And one of the things they come up with that they want her to do is film a sequence where she is paragliding. And so she's out there and this huge storm, I mean like a tornado-like storm, comes and blows her to North Korea, where she runs into a North Korean soldier. And the rest of the series pretty much revolves around the relationship between them. And yes, it does turn into a semi-romance. If you can stand a romance with, I think, maybe one kiss in the entire series, and a pretty chaste one at that. But a lot of interesting cultural comparisons between North and South Korea. But the main one I wanted to mention, which is available with subtitles, is a Japanese film with the English title Departures. The Japanese title is Okuribito. Has anyone heard of it?
I think I've heard of it, but I haven't watched it.
I'm a huge fan, Van. That's cool.
Oh, good.
It's
good. Yeah,
really,
I've heard of it
good.
also, but I have not seen it.
Yeah, I think it's a terrific film. Sure. It's a terrific film, I think, in showing a lot of things about Japanese customs, particularly customs surrounding death, because the departure is the way that the Japanese funeral industry helps departed souls make their way into the next world. And so there is this essentially little one-man funeral parlor operation. And a young man loses his job playing the cello in an orchestra, is looking for a job and gets roped in without knowing what kind of thing this company does. He thought Departures was some kind of delivery company. Um, and so they bring him in, and he realizes as he's going through his workday that what they are doing is putting the makeup and the clothing and everything else on deceased persons in preparation for sending them to the next world. And it's interesting to watch him at first horrified by what's going on in this company and considering, getting out of it. And later on in the film, his wife finds out and is like ready to leave him. It's you quit this job or I leave you kind of situation. And it gives a lot of insights into how the Japanese view death. And especially for me, I think the respect that they show to the deceased through the rituals that they use to prepare them for death, for after death. So I found the film fascinating, and Jeff, I'm glad you liked it too.
Well, what struck me about it was the intergenerational aspect, the
Yes.
relationship with the father. I'm a sucker for intergenerational reconciliation and love story. Not in the romantic sense, but yeah.
Have any of you seen not the same, not related, the movie The Farewell, the Chinese movie a couple years ago?
I wanted to see it, but I haven't seen it yet.
That was excellent. Just think about intergenerational and the theme of death and in Asian culture. It's an excellent film.
Yeah, I've got to see it. I really want to see it. Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. It's very amusing and very heartwarming. Really good.
I guess we'll have to put links to all these in our show notes, Liz.
Well, we will. Links to everything in the show notes. Absolutely. So you can find all these great recommendations.
Farewell is on Hulu.
So now we're gonna move on to our main topic today, which is the 2016 film of Silence by Martin Scorsese, whose last name is really hard to say. This is a super interesting book and film. I first encountered the book at BYU, actually in an art history class my freshman year. They had us read it, talking about icons and things. And then I reread it this summer, and now I've had the chance to watch the film, and it's a tough one, but it's really good. What were everybody's reactions to the film?
I think it's a really beautiful movie. I watched it a couple of years ago, and it's one of those that just has like sticks with you after you watch it. The images, they're beautiful, they're haunting. The themes I think are just really powerful. So I loved it. I just rewatched it and to prepare for this, and I really enjoyed it a second time immensely as well.
Yeah, it's a very challenging film, both in terms of its length. Which is 2 hours and 20 minutes or something.
2 hours 40.
Okay. Yeah. Not just in terms of its length, but also in terms of the intensity of what's happening in the narration, because it's dealing, of course, with the torture of Japanese Christians in the early 17th century, and you see some scenes of torture. The Japanese authorities have basically decided to eradicate this foreign religion, which they see as a threat to their sovereignty. And so the tortures, and the psychological pressure that's put on, particularly the main character, who is a Jesuit priest. It's really harrowing to watch. It demands a lot of the viewer. And I think one of the reasons that it wasn't more popular than it was is because it is just so challenging to watch and to really stay with it to see where it's going to lead you.
I definitely agree with that. The torture is definitely there. It's definitely impactful. And I think the psychological aspect of the torture is probably the more intense aspect. Like the actual violence itself is maybe not that much worse than a Marvel movie, right? But the violence is definitely not seen as exciting or interesting or yay, like it is in a Marvel movie. It is intense and you feel it.
Yes. On the other hand, I think it is remarkable how restrained the violence is, given that this is Martin Scorsese.
For sure.
Yeah,
Because
agreed.
he is, of course, renowned for some really horrific violence in a lot of his films, in mob films and things like that. And when I first found out he was going to make a film version of this novel, I was really worried that he was going to turn it into a bloodbath. And he didn't do that. And I was actually surprised and disappointed when it got an R rating. And I think part of that, yeah, there's a couple of scenes. We showed this at International Cinema at BYU. And we had to cut probably about maybe 45 seconds out of the entire film.
I know exactly which 45 seconds it was.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. But it really, it's the psychological demands. And, you know, an R rating, you say, okay, well, what age is a person really prepared to see a film of this kind of intensity, and the demands that it makes in terms of thinking about the issues of faith and losing faith. And I can see where those who give ratings might have felt like, a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old is not ready for that. This is not the kind of film that they're going to really be able to watch with great interest and be moved by the issues that it presents.
My sense is, unfortunately, if
yeah.
you're a movie that wants to get awards, an award, a movie that does a prestige film, you want the R rating because it bodes as mature. It's mature, and I don't think they were expecting this to be a big box office hit. So I think they're
no.
targeted to movie goers that are interested in prestige award movies, and so I think that the R rating is not a negative for them. It's a plus. They prefer the R rating, which I think is unfortunate.
Yeah, sometimes the serious films have to be R, and right. You can sometimes do a minor cut and it gets political and you get it down. Here, I'm going to be the skunk at the garden party and say I did not like this film. And I'm really intimidated saying that in front of you, Van, because you're the expert on this.
Everyone has the right to feel how they do about anything, so go right ahead.
But I will say, in its defense, it is not as superficial, right? In this day and age, you get. Aren't you also sick of the believer is the bigoted source of hate, difficulty, and when that person finally renounces their faith, right? They only have, it's like the stock character in Hollywood these days is the bigoted fundamentalist believer, and once they finally let go of that, everything gets better. To his credit, Scorsese does not do that. This is a much more sympathetic way. And nuanced, you get into these characters, you see them, and good art, and this is at least good art. I do not think this is a great movie. I do think it's a good movie, but I think good art and great art allows the viewer or the reader to come to it with their own thing. So, you read the reviews, and there's kind of a fundamentalist take on this that can simplify that discomfort, which I totally agree with you when you guys say, this is uncomfortable, right? This is really uncomfortable to watch, people getting tortured for their faith. And we have to ask ourselves, what would we do, right? Could we bear up under that? How would we bear up under that? Yes. And that's really uncomfortable to ask. And so you can give what I call, a fundamentalist answers to that. So one fundamentalist answer could say, well, these are icons, they're worshiping icons, and those are against God. So, of course, Jesus wouldn't save them, right? Another, I would still put this in the fundamentalist camp. Another review I read said, well, it's just these Portuguese colonialists, and they deserve what they have coming to them because they're just colonizing, and these colonizers shouldn't have been colonizing with their foreign culture and imposing that. And both of those, I think, are ways to resolve this discomfort that ultimately cheat us of a deeper some deeper moral insights.
And I don't think either of those readings is supported by the movie, right? One thing I really enjoyed about both the book and the film is it talks about how Christianity was initially accepted by the Japanese peasants because it was a religion that said you have worth
Yeah.
and you are beloved of God, and they brought that into the film.
And perhaps they're
Why it
the
was
Nephi.
valuable in this cross cultural interchange. It wasn't just colonialism one way. It was we
Right.
want
As if
this.
as if they didn't have their own oppressive feudal system and
Yes,
serfs and so
yes,
forth. But and
Absolutely.
I would say the heroes of the movie are those peasants actually in my
yes.
mind. But I had problems with the casting. I know there's opinions divided on this too. I feel like Andrew Garfield seemed like he was cosplaying to me the whole movie. I
Mm,
couldn't see him
mm.
there. Yeah, I know
Is
some
it just
people
because
loved
you've
it.
seen him too recently as Spider-Man?
I wondered that, but I thought he did a
Took
great
me
job
about
in
5 minutes to get used to Spider-Man as a
yes,
priest.
right. He was I loved him in Heartbreak Ridge though, which we can talk about some other movies I think do this better job, and Heartbreak Ridge has its flaws as well. It's Mel Gibson's belief in the redemptive power of violence, I think, but in this case, I would have swapped them. I think Adam Driver could have done a better job in Andrew Garfield's role and vice versa. And then I didn't like the
Hmm.
soundtrack. I don't think the soundtrack did
What
justice to
soundtrack?
right.
Exactly.
There is one, but most of the time, the movie's called Silence, right? But there's a
Yes.
lot of you can find the soundtrack on Spotify or other streaming services. Listen to it. It's very vacant and almost animistic. That's maybe a harsh, pejorative word, but there's a lot of nature sounds in the
Hmm.
soundtrack that
Hmm.
are layered over it. There was one the only track I really liked, started liking, was the one that they do when he gives the uh, uh, gosh, I don't the Eucharist. Want to use the
Yes,
right word,
yes.
and so didn't want to use our word for it. And but then at the end, there's this emptiness. They switch to some tones, and so I think this is harsh. I haven't read the book. I think this is Scorsese justifying his own compromised, lapsed faith. I think he's working out his own spiritual issues with this film and justifying his own compromises that he's made in his personal life. But hey,
Well,
that's
if I recall, and Van will probably know better than me, but like Endo wrote this book because he was also struggling with how to be a good Christian and a good Japanese person at the same time when these two
That's right.
identities are very much seen as in conflict.
Yes, yes,
mhm.
exactly, exactly. And I think, Jeff, I would agree that one of the things that attracted Scorsese to this novel is that struggle with holding on to or abandoning faith.
Mhm.
And Scorsese went through some really interesting ins and outs as far as he wanted to be a priest when he was 12, and actually started going to classes to prepare, and then changed his mind. But I think that his own struggle with his own personal faith is very much a part of why he held on to his plan to make this movie for over 25 years. He read the novel back in the 1980s and said, I'm going to make this into a movie. And he bought the
Yeah, he's been
rights.
working on this a long time.
Yeah, yeah. And so he was determined to make this film come hell or high water. And I shouldn't have used that image because there are some scenes in the film that really, but
Yes.
But
yeah.
can I comment on that? I
No,
think
please,
going
please.
to what Jeff said about the portrayal of Christians and character. I think what I love about the movie is that it really shows the power of the faith of especially the Japanese people that are these
Yes.
believers that are doing everything, willing to risk everything to remain true to their faith, willing to risk
Hmm.
torture. Some do betray their faith. Some do denounce their faith. But I think it just shows the incredible power of faith in their lives. And I don't know many movies that do that as well as this one does. That just shows believers how committed they are and how the kind of internal strength of faith that these individuals have to survive in this environment, where there's persecution and betrayals and risk of torture. So I don't know many movies that do that as well as this one did. It's just showing the power of faith to motivate people the way that this movie does. So I
And you
love
think
that.
of
In
that.
fact,
Go ahead. Go
I'm
ahead,
going to
Lisa.
jump in for just a second. My 11-year-old came in when I was watching the beginning of this movie, and it
Oh,
was just the part where they first arrive on the island, and they're like, the people are so happy to have them there, and they're baptizing the children, and my son was like totally rapt. And then I was like, the Inquisitor shows up, and I'm like, you gotta go now. This is not going to be good from this point on.
this
But
is going
like
downhill
that
real
whole part
quick,
of it
Good
is a
choice.
very heartwarming example of the redemptive power of religion in people's lives, and religion improving people's lives, which, yeah, you don't see much in films. It's always religion is damaging people's lives in current
Yeah.
Mhm.
film.
And to Daniel's point, you think of that amazing scene of the three crosses in the water,
Mm,
and they tie
So well
these
done.
three
Yeah.
Japanese peasants, and as the tides come in repeatedly, they are finally, they die from exposure and all kinds of things, but just watching their faces and hearing them, call out to God and to really show that they're not going to succumb to this torture because their faith is strong and they know that they will be saved because of their faith. And that's, it's a simple faith, but it's an incredibly powerful faith that you see in the faces of especially the one in the center, who
Mhm.
is he's actually a film director himself, but wonderful job
Really?
of acting. Yeah, he is. He is. In fact, he showed up at the tryouts, the casting tryouts for the film. And when he came up, it was his turn. He introduced himself, and Scorsese said, "Well, there's a Japanese film director by that name." And the guy said, "Yeah, that's me." And Scorsese said, "Well, what are you doing here?" And he said, "I just want the honor of being in a Scorsese film." And he, of course, was cast. Maybe not just because of that comment, but he did a phenomenal job.
he really did. Mokichi, that's the
Yes,
character's name.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, he was a very powerful character for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, he was.
I love. I mean, I think Liz, when we were discussing before the start, or in your thoughts, you mentioned the story in the book of Alma, where
Mm,
Alma and Amulek and others watch individuals being killed or burned for their faith, and
right,
that
in Amniha.
story reminds me a lot. Like this movie reminds me a lot of that story, and thinking about that story, Amulek watching and asking why is God allowing this? Why can't He reach out and stop it? I think
Yes.
that
And it
that's
also
very similar
specifically
to
made
the
me think of the Maxwell Institute came out with these brief theological introductions this
Mm-hmm.
last year, and Kylie Nielsen Turley did the one for Alma, and she talks about this and how before this incident, Alma is talking about fire and brimstone and hell for those who don't repent, and after this event, he never mentions those things again because he has seen people burn and he's seen
Mm-hmm.
hell, and
Mm-hmm.
so I related to this film for me in that seeing that happen has a huge impact on you as a missionary or a priest, as a person who converted these people.
Yeah.
Just that huge impact of seeing bad things happen to the people who you've helped find faith and then feeling some responsibility for that.
Yeah. And
Yes.
in the Book of Mormon, one of my favorite things in that story is afterwards, Alma takes Amulek into his house and comforts
Mm-hmm.
him after he's seen this destruction. So in the Book of
Mm-hmm.
Mormon, there's recognizing the toll of this destruction, and the seeing people you care about suffer for their faith, and you feel responsible for it. I think that the Book of Mormon has a lot to say about that. So I love the parallels there.
Yeah.
And to maybe extend that in another facet, what is the impact of a leader's apostasy? right? I mean, then we can get into the deviations of the book, of maybe the book, and certainly the movie from the historical. Some of the changes they made, which aren't always devious, but I am reminded of what Hesiod says. The Muses come to Hesiod in the beginning of Theogony, and they say, the Muses are the creative spirits, and they say, we know how to tell the truth. We know how to lie. Well, we know how to tell the truth, and we know how to tell lies that seem like truth, depending on how we want, right? And nothing can lie better than film, and especially with our modern, we can make sex seem totally free of consequences, right? You can make babies disappear in season 5, and nobody asks again where it goes. You can lie really well in movies, or make it. You can invert things, but in this case, with Rodrigues, who apostatizes, and historically he seems to actively participate in rooting out Christians afterwards. But it reminds me of when I was no comparison to these Jesuits, but I was sent as an elder to open a small town in France that hadn't had missionaries in many, many years. I think over a decade. And the sisters, the Relief Society, in faith, before even any missionaries had been assigned to this town, had sewn some baptism clothes, which so touched me. But their branch president and their district president, while they were in those roles, apostatized very vocally, and then with the church there, it took a long time to replace them, and so they were actively doing damage. And I ran into members, and this would have been 10 years earlier, and I actually met that district president. That's another story for another day. But so many of them had been baptized by the branch president or the district president, and so many of them had been taught gospel doctrine by these had been real people, and yet they kept their faith, right? The people that brought them in kept that faith. But you think, man, if your faith can survive your spiritual midwife or your mentor actively renouncing their belief, and you maintain it, that's some serious respect I had for those members.
Absolutely. And the Japanese authorities, of course, historically speaking, just tortured the Christian peasants. I'll make you give up your faith, and we'll just eradicate you all one by one, 10 by 10. But then they changed their strategy, and they thought, we can be much more effective if we can get a priest. If we can get a priest to apostatize, there goes his entire flock. And that there were, instances of that actually happening. So, the strategy, once they were able to capture a priest like Rodrigues and Garupe, they were delighted, because they saw that as the key to wiping Christianity out in Japan. And I think, I don't want to turn the conversation too dramatically, but I think the Christian elephant in the room here is the question of the silence of God.
Mm-hmm.
Because, the novel's called Silence.
As
is the movie. And there's a lot of silence in the soundtrack in the film, as Jeff has pointed out. And then you have the amazing scene where Rodrigues has been captured. He's gone through all this psychological torture. He's had to watch some of the Japanese Christian peasants be murdered before his eyes. And then, of course, his own Jesuit mentor was previously captured by the Japanese authorities and was forced to apostatize. So you've got him also pushing Rodrigues to step on an image of Christ to indicate his own apostasy. And you have that amazing scene where Rodrigues is brought to the image that is on the ground. And this is where you get the most silence in the film, because
Yeah.
there's
Everything
absolutely not
stops.
a single sound. And it actually is also done in slow motion. It's the only slow motion scene in the
Yeah.
film, as we see Rodrigues literally falling onto the image after he has stepped on it. Now, there is a spoiler, folks.
Yeah.
Well, full spoilers in this podcast. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the big question is, um, did he actually hear a voice before he stepped on the image?
Yeah.
Was it a voice that was just
Oh,
only in his own head? Was it his? Was he hallucinating a voice?
that's
Was he
interesting.
imagining maybe somebody will say this to me and I'll be okay doing this? Um,
Yeah.
for some of us, and I'll include myself in that, um, I very strongly believe that the voice he hears is the voice of Christ, and the voice has broken the silence, and has told him that Christ's own suffering, has covered for Rodriguez's weakness, for his inability to finally stand up and martyr himself, allow himself to be martyred.
And
Um,
allow all the people he's taught to be
Interesting because
martyred, which is the more worse thing, right?
yeah,
yes.
what I find really interesting is what you said. I mean, you see this with people with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, people who feel like they receive revelations that they should leave the church or that they should do something
Right.
contrary to it. And I think you
Right.
always
Right.
need to question that and ask if that really coming from God. What I find interesting here is throughout the movie, Rodriguez, at least twice, I think, urges others to be willing to trample on icons. He
Yes.
says, it's not a
Yes.
big deal to do this. You'll be forgiven for doing this. So I think he's set himself up for this ultimately,
Yes.
to say it's okay to do
That's right.
this to save
That's right.
lives. So he's previewed that. I guess my discomfort with him and with Ferreira, the other priest,
The
uh,
apostate
mature
priest. Yeah.
figure,
Mhm.
is that they then go and not just willing to stamp on the icon, but then they spend the rest of their life writing and agreeing to write things against their beliefs, even when they you can tell they still hold those beliefs, and so that's what I don't find acceptable. I
Mhm.
find that to
Mhm.
be morally unacceptable. I think
Yes.
being
Yes.
willing to sacrifice, to denounce, to save lives is one thing, but then I think then dedicating your time and your efforts, especially Ferreira, intellectually writing books, critiquing belief in Christ, I think that's a line that I don't think is morally acceptable to cross.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's right.
But we see in the film, I feel like the film has a much more definitive ending to it than does the
Oh,
book, if I
yes.
recall. The book kind of leaves it ambiguous as to whether he still believes, even though he's apostatized. But the movie makes it pretty clear that he's praying with Kichijiro. He's possibly provided him with this icon that Kichijiro is then caught with and
Mhm. Mhm.
presumably martyred for. And then in the end, his wife buries him with this cross that he's held
Yeah.
onto all this
Yes.
time.
Yes.
Um, so I think that makes it
Yes,
makes it interesting
it
because he
does.
still believes, and yet he is forced to keep writing out, recanting his faith over and over throughout his life. He's always brought back to publicly denounce it
Mhm.
over and over. And I think the one thing that makes it work is that we've set up Kichijiro
Yes.
throughout the whole thing, that he's been doing the same thing that Rodriguez ends up doing, having to apostatize over and over and still believing. Where we
And
see
potentially betray people, right?
right,
Yes.
A
right, and
little
we see
Yes.
ambiguous,
Kichijiro
but
doing that again, and Rodriguez struggling to forgive him and to accept him back. And then at the end, he is reconciled with Kichijiro, and I can kind of see that is kind of the relationship between Kichijiro and Rodriguez is the same relationship between Rodriguez and God.
Yeah. And
Yes.
well, and
Kichijiro,
that's
I
why I
think,
think that's Scorsese's fantasy. I think Scorsese identifies with the Kijijiro, and I think that's the redemption he's hoping for. Is it cheap redemption? But anyway.
But I think what's not cheap to me about Kichijiro is that, I mean, despite everything, he has left Japan. He could easily have run away, have left completely, but he comes back to Japan to bring these missionaries, and then he
Yes.
doesn't leave. He betrays them. He comes back. He Rodriguez apostatizes, and he stays nearby because he wants to
Mhm.
be near this priest. So I think he's, the kind of deepness of that, like he doesn't leave, he doesn't depart, he comes back repeatedly, says something about Kichijiro that I think is very endearing and redemptive about
Yeah,
Kichijiro.
yeah. I mean, he keeps, he fears the tortures for good reason.
Which we all do.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, nobody wants that.
But every time he falls, he gets back up again, and he cannot stand not being near Rodriguez, even when Rodriguez is in the prison. And so, it's this whole, I mean, for me, it's a wonderful metaphor of sin and forgiveness. The way that we all sin repeatedly, do the thing that we would not do,
Yep.
Mhm.
and then seek forgiveness for what we have done, and finding that the mercy of Christ makes that forgiveness available. I think for me, that works very nicely in that character of Kichijiro.
Can I add a thought on the silence of God, how we handle it? First of all, there are other instances where the question of how we interpret those, right? Like at the
Mm-hmm.
beginning of the movie, they see a bird, I think, and they say, "That's a sign, that we're supposed to be here," right? And then right
Mm-hmm.
after that, the bad guys show up. And then
Right.
when he's drinking in that pond or that river bend,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and he sees the image of Christ from his that he venerated as a child, and then right after that, the bad guys show up again. Uh, but we do all struggle with that, right? I do connect with that idea that how, right, we can have legitimate spiritual experiences, but then are they, how we interpret them is very often where we trip up. And
Yes.
especially when there's silence, right? How do we interpret that silence? So this is a favorite book of mine. It's called When You Can't Come Back by Dave Dravecki. He's just a Christian. It's not a Latter-day Saint book, but
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
he was a pitcher for the Padres and got cancer in the same arm, his throwing arm.
Oh dear.
So it just seems really cruel. And we can get the primary answers, right? That God will always answer your prayers, and I believe that. But the question is when, right?
Yes.
Some of
Yes.
these
And
answers we
how?
probably right. Some of these answers we aren't going to get maybe in this life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hebrews
Mm-hmm.
11 teaches us these all died in the faith, not having seen the promises fulfilled.
Yes.
And so that's where we look to the next life to complete our existence and our being, right? Where Christ, if we end Christ's story at the crucifixion, we've missed the best part of it, and I think that's true for our lives. But
Yes.
when we interpret, how do we interpret, and what story do we tell about that silence? And that is such a critical thing to do. How do we, right? God's not there. God doesn't love me. I've sinned. I've been, right. We have to be so careful when we have that silence. Here's what Dave Dravecki says. Looking back, we have learned that the wilderness is part of the landscape of faith and every bit as essential as the mountaintop. On the mountaintop, we are overwhelmed by God's presence. In the wilderness, we are overwhelmed by his absence.
Mm-hmm.
Both places should bring us to our knees. The one in utter awe, the other in utter dependence. One by one, the wilderness took from us everything we had depended upon in place of God. It took away our physical health, our mental and emotional health, our church, our friends, and even took us away from each other. All those things that we relied on for our strength were gone. We were forced to turn to God because there was no one else to turn. At times, the wilderness seemed to be distant. In the wilderness of our own suffering, we said, "Oh God, how I search for you, how I thirst for you." It was in the wilderness we eventually learned to trust God, even though at times every visible trace of him had vanished. The spiritual starkness of the wilderness was what was so difficult to deal with. But we finally came to the point that Habakkuk did when he prayed, Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls, yet will I rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful to my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of the deer, and he enables me to go on the heights. Jan and I, that's his wife, can't say that we had the feet of a deer as we went through the wilderness. Ours were a lot more clumsy than that. But I can honestly say we had the will to walk. And I believe we walked to please God, to trust him, to love him, to obey him, even in the wilderness, even with our stumbles.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's really beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like this film captured, especially the ending, the more explicitly believing ending, captured the fact that even though he's being forced to recant his faith all the time, he's still faithful to God, even though he's not able to live it in the way that he'd like. He's
Right.
prevented from doing that because of circumstances. Because I feel like part of the psychological torture of this film is the Japanese Inquisitor Inoue.
For the viewer, the torture for the viewer
Yeah,
to watch
well,
it. Yeah.
and for him, both.
Yeah.
Just
Yes.
the false logic that is saying you need to, it will be Christ-like of you to renounce your faith for these people, and ignoring the fact that they are the ones who have created this situation, right? It's kind of
Right.
our
Right.
agency. We don't have agency to do this. You're just in this situation, and the only right thing to do is to do this, ignoring the fact that we caused this situation.
I guess I still wonder whether, in the initial moment when your choice was renounce and save people, there were 5 people being tortured in front of you, is a different question than what do you do decade after decade when you're being used as a symbol for your loss of faith. And I guess I'm not as comfortable with what he does continuing in that role, continuing to be a symbol of loss of faith. I think whatever the initial reaction at the moment when you stop people from being tortured, I'm very sympathetic to that. But I think that I think at some point, you need to either denounce that, stop writing things that are contrary to your beliefs, stand up against it, even if that means your death. Even if you die, I think he was willing to be a martyr before that, and I think that his unwillingness to do so afterwards, being so broken, is something that I have had a hard time with.
Should we
What else?
move to some other films that I think explore some of these issues? In my opinion, better. But than this
I am
one?
interested
Well,
in hearing some related films that discuss
Yeah.
this problem.
I would, but I'd love to hear more from Van about his
Oh,
role
yeah. Yeah, let's do that.
making the film, and consulting it, and what your role was and how you got involved with the project. I'd love to hear more about that.
Okay, well, but let's not forget this issue of films to compare. But
Yeah, I agree.
I had translated, I think, 3 or 4 of Endo's other works when the production of this film finally got started after so many years of starting and stopping. And I was contacted by Scorsese's research assistant, a wonderful woman named Marianne Bauer, who did a phenomenal job getting details of everything in this film right. I mean, one of the really amazing things about this film, it's made, filmed in Taiwan by a New York film director who also wrote the screenplay with a collaborator. And the question is, this is a Japanese story. How are the Japanese going to respond to this film? Are they going to see, are they going to see time after time after time where the Scorsese just got it wrong, where it wasn't true to Japan? There was literally none of that in the Japanese response to the film that I saw. And I think that speaks very highly of both Scorsese's interest in getting details right, and also the work of Marianne, who was doing the research for the film. But I was contacted by Marianne in 2011 and asked if I could provide them with a little bit of help. And I said, sure. And then I didn't hear from her again until 2014. So a 3-year lapse because Scorsese kept making other films instead of Silence. And then finally, we settled in 2014. And I don't know, I haven't counted, but I think there were literally hundreds of emails flying back and forth between me and Marianne. As Scorsese is
Wow.
feeding questions to her, and she's asking me, and then I'm giving the answer back to her, and she's the interlocutor who passes it on to Scorsese. But I think probably where I felt like my contribution really meant something to me, because also I guess I should also mention that I knew Endo, the author of the novel, really quite well. Spent a lot of time with him
You
in
had him come to
Japan.
BYU. He came to
Yeah.
BYU too, didn't you? Get him to come campus?
No, he
Okay.
never made it to BYU, unfortunately. He did go. He did make it to New York a couple of times, but he didn't ever get to BYU, unfortunately. I wish I'd been able to get him there. Um, in any case, what was of critical importance to Endo, and I knew this from many conversations with him, was the interpretation of what that voice of Christ says to Rodrigues, because it obviously plays, I mean, that's the vital turning point in the story.
The critical moment. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the critical moment. And with all due respect to the person who translated this book into English, he got it wrong. And Endo knew he got it wrong. And everyone in Japan knew he got it wrong. And some of us who worked with Endo's writings knew that he got it wrong. And the difference, and I'll try to be brief about this. The difference, of course, is the voice when it speaks to Rodrigues in the English translation says trample with an exclamation point. And then it says trample with an exclamation point. Well, maybe it's just me, but when I see an exclamation point with a word like that, it sounds very much like an imperative.
Yeah, command.
A command. You have got to do this. And that's one way of looking at it, but it's not what the Japanese says. What the Japanese voice says at that moment from the image is, it's all right to step on me. Go ahead and step on me. That's why I came into the world. That's why I was born, to suffer for all of your pains and take them on myself. And for me, that's a huge difference in terms of trying to understand, because, it's either a harsh, commanding voice, which doesn't make sense to me in the context of the novel, or it's a gentle, forgiving voice. Endo would later talk frequently about his image of God / Christ, being Catholic, being a maternal figure. His problem with Western Christianity was that it was a paternal religion. It was the religion of God the Father. But for Endo, from his own personal experience growing up with his mother, and from his own understanding of how to be a Japanese Christian, was that God / Christ is a loving, forgiving companion to those who suffer. And that is Christ's role. It's to be there always with the sufferer and to share in their suffering, maybe not healing them, but at least being there to say, I'm with you. I will not abandon you. I am here for you. And that's very much what I think that voice is trying to say in the way that Endo wrote that scene. And I think
really
that's
cool.
critical to understanding what's going on there. And so, anyway, my point being, because Scorsese only had access to the English translation, he, of course, didn't read Japanese, he kept asking about, what does the Japanese say here? And what does the Japanese say there? Because I'm afraid that I pretty much early on convinced him that he couldn't fully rely on the English translation. that it had issues.
Sounds like good for you. Yeah.
And so
That's really cool.
our most extensive back and forth had to do with that voice of Christ and what the voice says. Because I think he was pretty much strongly influenced by the English translation, the trample business. And I had to explain from a number of different angles, including Endo's personal life and views, that what he was searching for was a gentle, soft, forgiving, maternal voice that is there to be with Rodrigues, even when he is stepping on his face, Christ's face.
Well, and
So
there's
I,
good evidence for that in the scriptures as well, right? Like, how often would I gather you as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and sooner would a
yes,
nursing mother forget her child than I would forget thee, right?
right,
That
Well, not
right,
to
that
mention
maternal aspect of God is in there.
the bridegroom, and the bride of the church. Yeah, the
Yeah.
wedding
yeah,
feast. I guess
yeah,
we're
exactly.
the female figure there, but yeah.
Right, but still, yeah, I get the point. So I think that was probably what, for me personally, was my biggest contribution to the film, other than a lot of little things along the way. And I did my best with those, tried to answer as well as I could. And of course, Scorsese then took it and went whatever direction he wanted to go with it. But I'd have to say, and I've heard many Japanese say this, they are amazed at how faithful the film is to the book, even
Yeah, I
though
was
even though
surprised.
the ending of the film is different, even though it is a big assumption on Scorsese's part. And I don't know if it was him or his co-writer that came up with that, but it's not in the novel, and it's not anything I recommended to them. So they, on their own, and they know this may be where we see Scorsese's own personal, religious views, that clinging, having the cross there as his corpse is going to be burned, um, holding that cross there as the flames surround his corpse, may be sort of Scorsese's own personal reflection on what his faith means to him. And casting that on Rodrigues, I don't think is unfair. I think it fits Rodriguez's character as I read him.
That is really, really cool. That's really cool.
Yeah, and
The inside track on that.
yeah, and I guess the last thing I'd say about that long distance collaboration is that about 2 months before the film was released, I was invited back to New York to Scorsese's offices, and I sat down with Marianne and watched the almost final cut of the film. Because they wanted to see my reaction to it. They wanted me to give them some notes on what I saw. And then after I saw the film, after I talked to Marianne for a while about my reaction, after I, emotionally came down from the ceiling or off the wall or the ground, wherever I was, I guess I had fallen to the ground, but wherever I was, I've finally pulled myself together. And she says, "Well, let's go meet Marty." And I'm like, "You mean like Marty Scorsese?" And she says, "Yeah." So we go down the hall, and there he is, the man himself. He is so short. I've got a picture of me with him. Yeah, I've got a picture of me with him, and he's a very short man. But got to meet him. He asked me what I thought of the film. And my first response, I don't know what else I said because I was still sort of starstruck.
Yeah.
But my first comment was from everything I know of knowing Mr. Endo and of knowing his work, I think he would be very pleased with this film. And Scorsese seemed to be very pleased with that reaction. And then I thought I was done, shake his hand and then I'm out the door. And he says, "Please have a seat." So I sit down and we just start chatting. Nothing terribly profound that will go into the annals of film history. I did ask him because there was a Japanese film version of Silence that came out in the early 1970s, I think. Which
the book was written in 1962, I believe.
66.
Anyway, 66. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. There's a Japanese film version and a fairly well-known Japanese director. The film, Endo hated the film, and I thought it was an abomination because it doesn't catch any of the real, it doesn't deal with any of the real religious issues. It doesn't catch any of what Endo is trying to do in the story. So it horrified me when I saw it. So I asked Scorsese if he had seen that version of that film version, and he said, "No, I haven't seen it yet." He said, "But I'm going to be in Tokyo in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to be there. I'm going to be meeting the director, so I've got to say something to him." And I didn't try to influence him. I said, "Okay, well, maybe you want to see the film before you talk to him. But I don't know how you deal with, I just made the real film version of this book. I don't know what you say to the Japanese director." But anyway, we sat, and then he called in. He asked the film editor to come in, Thelma Shoemaker, and she came in and she joined the conversation. Her question was really interesting. She said, "How are the Japanese going to respond to these foreigners making a film about how horrible their authorities were in torturing their own people?" And I said, "Well, this story is so well known to the Japanese people. And they, having gone through World War II, where they were viciously betrayed by their leaders, I don't think they're going to have a problem at all with the way this film presents the Japanese authorities." And so I think she felt a little better about that, but that was a big issue for her. But we talked, I think we probably talked for about an hour, took a couple of souvenir photos, and off I went. And that was it. But that was a great experience. It really was.
Man, that's just so fascinating. I love it.
Really?
Oh.
I love that. That's really cool to have the inside track on this movie.
Well, I almost hate to do ratings on a film like this because it's just such a great film. But we're going a little long, so I'm probably going to move to the ratings. In terms of content, it's difficult to rate this film because it is an R-rated film. But it's not that kind of R-rated film.
It's not the kind. Yeah, it's rated R because this is a difficult adult topic, but it's not got sex or nudity. There is some violence, but honestly, it's pretty.
It's biblical. It's Book of Mormonish. Like if you read the scriptures and are comfortable with that level of violence, that's what it is.
Even the beheading.
There's PG-13s that are more violent than this by far.
Absolutely.
And
even the beheading, you don't see the sword actually cut off the head.
Yeah. There is a little squirt blood thing.
There is a squirt of blood.
The part that was most violent in my mind was the body after being decapitated being dragged on the screen. That was the part that was the most clearly earned its R rating, but I think that it was all done with a purpose. I don't think any of it's gratuitous at all.
Yeah.
No.
It's done with the purpose of saying this is horrific and you're supposed to feel horrified, which is how Rodrigues feels.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know how to rate that on our celestial, terrestrial rating system. I just don't know what to do.
I don't recall any foul language.
No, there's none. There's none.
No.
Nope.
So, I mean, I'm tempted to give it a celestial rating, but with a don't do this until you're 25. When I read it as a freshman at BYU, I just did not get this book. And now, a decade and some odd years later, it's much more comprehensible to me. So it's definitely a serious movie for when you're mature and you don't want to introduce this too young.
Can we do a celestial minus?
Celestial minus. There you go.
Like an A minus, you know.
Don't watch it with your grandma, but
it's the
Right,
the
or
weeping
your young
God,
kids.
like Enoch's vision of God weeping over the world. It's that kind of celestial.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
In terms of artistic merit, we were rating on a scale of 1 to 5 popcorn balls. I thought the film was beautiful. I know Jeff has some issues with the soundtrack, but I mean, I thought the cinematography and just like the pacing of the film, I thought it was great. I would give it 5.
Yeah.
I'll be the stinker. I give it 3. I thought it was too long in certain places. I thought it meandered. I know Scorsese thought he was, I think I know what he was trying to do. I don't think he pulls it off. So it's beautifully shot, incredible. So in that sense, but I think it does drag in places it didn't need to. It does meander a bit. So I'm going to dock it a little bit. I'm sorry.
That's totally fine.
And you can probably guess that I'm going to give it a 5. So.
Yeah,
Daniel?
I hope so. I'm glad to hear that. I would as well. I think that it. I mean, I love I think the pacing, especially the second half of the movie when he's, really the movie's three parts. Or the first part when they're on the run, or on away, and then the second part when he's captured, Rodriguez, and the third part after his betrayal. That second part is so well done. I think so well paced from in my mind, showing the transformation and his loss, what leads him to the point where he betrays his faith, and I think that's so well done. I that part is just amazing to me. I love how what Scorsese did there. So
For sure. And then we've got Gospel Connections, 1 to 5 apricots. I have a feeling we're going to differ on this one as well, but I mean, I think this is a really, really important film. I would give it 5 apricots, just even if you don't agree that he should have apostatized and you struggle with this issue of he's continually having to renounce the church and write against it. It brings up these difficult issues in a way that's very much like, almost like the story of Abraham and Isaac that we just read about in Gospel Doctrine, where it's a difficult issue to wrestle with. And because of that, I think it's a very morally edifying film, even if you don't agree with the eventual conclusion of the film.
And it's certainly a morally challenging film.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. I mean, I apologize.
Go ahead.
I say I agree 100% with that. I think even though I think ultimately I don't morally agree with his choice, I think the movie is portrays that choice brilliantly, and I love the ambiguity of it. I love the questions it poses about what do we do when I think two things that really stand out to me. One, what do we do when God is silent, when we don't hear God, and there's times when we doubt, are we doing the right thing? Really connected with me. I joined the church in undergrad, and my family was not like, I'm the only member of the church in my family. My family threatened to disown me, and really called me out and said that I think we think what you're doing is evil. Going as a missionary was to them the worst thing I could possibly do in the world, like equivalent to joining a neo-Nazi gang. And I have a lot of faith and a lot of certainty, but there's the moments when you wonder, like the consequences of what you're doing, and you kind of face those consequences. That really resonated with me, and really, in this movie, really connected with me, and so I thought it was a lot of really great gospel connections.
That's cool. But we got to pin you down. How many out of 5?
I give it 5. Yeah, I would give it 5.
Okay, go ahead, Jeff. Pull it down.
Offer our dissenting opinion. Do it. That's why you're here.
I've got to go to 3 because I do think it's worthwhile. Right? 3 is kind of 2. If you got nothing better to do. 3 is, yes, it's still worthwhile, right? And so I'm going to give it a 3. It does raise some really worthwhile questions. So
yeah.
Okay, good. And of course, I'm a 5.
Right, well, there you have it. There's.
Yes, can I throw in a couple of movies here, Liz?
Yes, we forgot to come back to that. Yes, please throw in a couple of titles for us.
I alluded to Heartbreak Ridge. It is way more violent, so it's not a celestial movie in that sense. It is very inspiring, and it's about, how do you hold true to your beliefs in hell? So that's valuable, I think. I would rate it, in my book, about the same as this movie. I'm probably offending somebody there. And then The Mission, Roland Joffe's The Mission, I think
Yes.
is a better movie in every way. It doesn't touch on exactly the same themes, so it's not replaceable with that. But the soundtrack is sublime.
Yes.
The cinematography is beautiful. I think the pacing is better in that film, and again, what do you do? You've got these authorities, and you've got a compromised leadership there that made there, and how do you deal with? You've got this flock you're loyal to, and do you lay down your life with them or not? Anyway, I think, and it deals with the disappointment, and maybe I'm sentimental about this movie because I'd seen it years ago. And then I dealt with a disappointment. I thought God was going to come through with me in a certain way, and he didn't. And I watched this movie, The Mission, and just wept through the whole thing because I knew the ending at that point, but it was really therapeutic and cathartic to me, and healing for me to watch that. So I've got a personal bias there. And the last one is a more recent film by Terrence Malick called A Hidden Life. Again, he's wanted to be conscripted he lives in this idyllic little village, and then they want him to swear fealty to, he's Austrian, so this is after the Anschluss. He has to swear fealty to Hitler and fight in the war, and he won't. And I love this idea of a hidden life. The title, because, and you see this in Silence as well with the peasants, where the authorities can crush your body, they can kill you, but faith, authentic faith, they cannot touch that place. There is that life of faith that can survive all kinds of things. And so the title, I love the title, and the music is by James Newton Howard, again, beautiful soundtrack. But that idea of not compromising, but while having terrible loss and suffering this great loss, but having that hidden life of faith, right? And again, we think of the Book of Mormon where they had to pray in secret or other things. How do you maintain your faith in that? I loved how it wrestled with that. So that's another one I liked.
Well, there you go. Maybe watch those together. Do a movie flight.
There you go. They're all really heavy, so you want to watch maybe Scorsese's After Hours or one of his comedies in the middle there. I don't know.
There you go.
Watch Hugo.
There you go.
There you go. Nice light one.
Yes.
Okay. Well, where can we find you guys online, Daniel?
Let's see. I'm on Facebook, on Twitter. I blog sometimes at Nauvoo Neighbor. I do mostly on my own, like Facebook and Twitter content that I put out for the most part.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Jeff, where can we find you?
You can find me on Public Square magazine mostly, and then on Twitter I'm at Jeff S. Benyon. You can see me on there, but you probably shouldn't. We should all stay away from Twitter.
Oh, Twitter.
And also on Public Square sometimes as well.
Yeah.
Indeed. And Van, where can people find your work?
I'm on Facebook, but I don't really post there unless, the life-changing experiences, birth of a grandchild or something like that. I use Instagram, but only to post things that I think are funny. So mostly just funny memes is all. So that's, not worth anybody's time. But, as far as I've translated 8 of Endo's works, you can find those on Amazon, or you can just Google me and find out all kinds of ridiculous things about me. And most of it true, some of it suspect, but it's out there. I mean, there's one of my students, I have to point this out. I have a Wikipedia page, but one of my students created it. I had nothing to do with it.
I mean, that's the rules of Wikipedia. You can't create your own page. Somebody else has to make it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't believe anything you read about me on Google. I'll just warn you up front.
And you can find my writing and book reviews on lizbusby.com. This has been Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, encouraging you to seek out everything virtuous, lovely, of good report, or praiseworthy. See you next time.